plenary speaker, John Gray. John is Reader in Languages in Education at UCL Institute of Education, University College London. His research interests are in the global spread of English, as well as issues of gender and sexuality in language teaching and beyond. He's the author of The Construction of English, Culture, Consumerism and Promotion in the ELT Global Coursebook, and the edited volume, Critical Perspectives on Language Teaching Materials. He is also co-author of a number of publications, and he is published as well in numerous journals, such as Applied Linguistics, ELT Journal, Gender and Language, among others. I first met John 22 years ago when he was my course tutor on my very first TESOL certificate course. And to this day, his understanding and encouragement, both towards me and every other trainee on that course, has stayed with me. I am sure that you can all, no matter how long ago it was, you can all remember your first teaching practice or observation. Well, I distinctly remember mine. I'm not sure that John will, but for different reasons, I remember mine. And I was so nervous. My legs were shaking, and I genuinely wasn't convinced that they would actually support me for the whole of the lesson. So in my infinite wisdom, I thought the best solution was to sit on the chair at the front of the room for the whole of the lesson, which I proceeded to do. And do well. I gave instructions from the chair. I monitored, not too closely, from the chair. I didn't have very much board work, as you can imagine, with the result that I got through the teaching practice and the observation. But needless to say, I was actually dreading the feedback session. And I will always remember the feeling that John opened the feedback and began that by saying he was very impressed with how comfortable I was to be able to sit relaxed in the chair and deliver a lesson. So I'm absolutely, and I went on to deliver lessons standing from the front and back of the classroom, so it worked out. But I am absolutely thrilled that we'll all get to experience that positivity and that encouragement and that outlook today. And I know that we'll get an awful lot from this plenary. So please welcome John Gray.
Thank you, Lou, for those very kind comments. I'd forgotten all about that, I have to say. Before I get started, what I'd like to do is just to say thank you to IATEFL for inviting me to give this plenary talk, and to thank all of you for coming along this morning, and to thank everybody who's watching online. Okay. I'd like to begin by saying that I want to locate this talk on gender and sexuality in ELT within a very particular view of education and of teacher identity. And that might seem like quite a strange place to begin, but what it means to be a teacher has changed dramatically over the last 40 years. Since the late 1970s, neoliberal reform across much of the world has had a significant and detrimental effect on education. And from the neoliberal perspective, whether of government or of the edu-businesses within which we're all imbricated, the teacher is increasingly understood as an effective practitioner, that is, an efficient deliverer of narrowly defined and easily measured content. Such an identity, of course, is at odds with other models of the teacher, for example, as a reflective practitioner, capable, in the words of my colleague Bob Cowan, of permanently re-examining the social fabric and social assumptions about the purposes of schooling within which he or she must daily practice. It's also at odds with other views of the teacher as a critical pedagogue or as a theorizing practitioner, or, in the words of the philosopher John Dewey, as a socially necessary kind of thinker. However, despite the constraints within which we work, many teachers continue to lay claim to these identities, and I will suggest in this talk that it's essential for us as a profession that we continue to do so if issues of gender and sexual diversity are to be addressed in any kind of educationally meaningful way. In arguing thus, I'm aligning myself with scholars such as Bell Hooks, who contends that despite the role of education as a key element in the ideological state apparatus, concerned overwhelmingly today with the production of workers with the skills and dispositions needed to compete in the global economy, teaching and learning need to be understood in less instrumental, more humanistic terms. For Hooks, teaching is best understood as an activity that is carried out with the aim of enabling students to live more fully in the world. That is, it is one that is transgressive in its explicit recognition of the political nature of all pedagogy, including her own, and in its recognition of the need to engage with the differences as well as the intersections and the hidden injuries of class, race, gender, and sexual orientation. From this perspective, teaching is inseparable from the practice of social justice, or, as Hooks puts it, the practice of freedom. And the model of the teacher as an effective practitioner is wholly inadequate. Now, before going any further, I want to step back and look at the evolving legal landscape with regard to gender and sexuality globally. I'll then comment briefly on the way in which this legislative reform plays out in various educational settings, as well as in the ELT industry. And I'll reflect on why the picture I paint is the way it is, before going on to look at some issues surrounding inclusive education and queer pedagogy. I'll then conclude by looking at some innovative work being done in a variety of different settings, which suggest possible ways forward. Now, you'll be aware, I think most of you will be aware, that there's a lot of terminology in this area and a lot of acronyms. So I'm going to keep things simple, and I'll just use LGBT to refer to people who self-identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. And I'll also, of course, use the word queer, although this word has slightly different political connotations, which I'll talk about later when I come on to queer theory. And any other terms that occur along the way, I'll gloss as I go along. Okay, writing in 2007, the sociologist Jeffrey Weeks reflected in his book, The World We Have Won, on the extraordinary social change that has taken place in many parts of the world from the last quarter of the 20th century onward with regard to sexual and gender diversity. Weeks argues that such social change is part of the long and as yet unfinished process of the democratization of everyday life. And it's hard to disagree, or at least it is hard to disagree initially, with his overall optimistic assessment. In the most recent report by ILGA, the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association, a body which has consultative status on the UN Economic and Social Council, categorizes data from around the world under three headings: criminalization, protection, and recognition. It points out that criminalization is decreasing globally. Legal protection against discrimination and violence is expanding, and legal recognition of partnerships is increasingly being won. Concretely, the report notes that 124 countries out of a total of 193 recognized by the UN do not criminalize or have decriminalized homosexual acts between consenting adults. 22 states allow for same-sex marriage, and a further 28 allow for various forms of civil partnership. In the UK alone, there's been a raft of legislative reform over the last 20 years affecting the lives and rights of LGBT people. One of the most important pieces of legislation here is the 2010 Equality Act, which identifies 9 protected characteristics as the basis for a wide-ranging anti-discrimination law that is focused on the workplace and the provision of public services, including education. 3 of these relate directly to those identifying as LGBT, namely gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, and sexual orientation. Now, in response to the Act, Ofsted, the Government Education Standards Agency in England, updated its inspection handbook for colleges of further education in 2012. It identified LGBT learners as a group whose, and I'm quoting, needs, dispositions, aptitudes, or circumstances may mean that they require particularly perceptive and expert teaching, and in some cases, additional support, although no indications were given as to what that might mean in terms of classroom practice, a point that I'll return to later. However, despite such legislative reform, the picture overall is complex and in many settings far from rosy. The ILGA report points out that things have actually got worse for LGBT people in some criminalizing countries, while at the same time it is clear that the world we have won is also constantly under threat. We also need to bear in mind that legislative reform does not equate straightforwardly with being able to live more fully in the world. And it's here that I would suggest that we, as teachers, have a crucial role to play. The UNESCO 2016 report, Out in the Open, addresses the issue of violence against LGBT students and the ways in which education sectors globally have responded to this. The report, which is the first of its kind, draws on data from 94 countries in both the global north and the global south. And if we look here at this, the executive summary, as you can see, the report concludes that significant numbers of LGBT students experience violence at school, more so than their non-LGBT peers. And of course, it's not just LGBT students, but also those whose gender presentation is seen as failing to conform with heteronorms. Needless to say, such violence impacts negatively on these students in many ways. The report also points out that despite progressive legislation in some countries, when it comes to curriculum and learning materials globally, and I quote, the education sector appears hesitant to include representations of diverse sexual orientations or gender identities / expressions in the curriculum. And the overwhelming majority of existing materials still consist of heteronormative representations and representations of traditional masculine and feminine roles. Heteronormativity, as these images suggest, refers to the multiple ways in which the social and institutional structures produce, promote, and maintain heterosexuality as the default sexual orientation for all human beings, while simultaneously policing the behavior of those whose presentation, desires, or practices deviate from the norm. It's also based on a clear male-female gender binary, in which gender roles are culturally often very clearly delineated. Similarly, when it comes to teacher education, the UNESCO report notes, and again I quote, in most countries, educational staff lack adequate training and resources to help them understand and address sexual orientation and gender identity and expression, and more specifically, homophobic and transphobic violence. The report points out that where interventions do take place, they are generally in-service, small-scale, and not mandatory. Now, if we look at our own field of ELT, and in particular at the powerful commercial sectors of textbook publishing and global testing, we find that the major silence with regard to sexual orientation identified by Alistair Pennycook nearly 20 years ago is as deafening today as ever. A small survey I carried out in 2013 of 10 top-selling ELT textbooks produced in the UK for global consumption found that there was a blanket avoidance of any LGBT representation in terms of characters and in terms of reading and listening activities. Predictably, what I found was the familiar construction of what Cynthia Nelson refers to as the monosexual community of interlocutors used for language teaching and learning. Similar findings were recorded by Scott Thornbury in 1999, and more recently by Łukasz Kapuła, Joanna Pawełczyk, and Jane Sunderland in their excellent book, Gender and Sexuality in English Language Education, Focus on Poland, which was published in 2015. And unfortunately, such erasure is not accidental, although it is, I would suggest, becoming increasingly untenable. As part of my research into LGBT erasure, I interviewed some lesbian and gay teachers about their experience of working with such materials. One teacher, who I will call Mark, and who has since left the profession, described his experience of being a writer for a well-known global English language test. The test provider's guidelines stipulate that there can be no mention of sexuality in any text produced for testing purposes, although it was clear that references to heteronormative families were completely acceptable. My informant took the prohibition on sexuality to be shorthand for no mention of LGBT people. However, he pointed out that the test provider's understanding of normativity actually went much further than this. At a test standardization meeting with a representative of the testing company, it emerged that one writer had included a text that featured an unmarried mother who had a boyfriend rather than a husband. As we can see in this interview extract from Graham Morton 2018, the representative suggests an edit. Let's just make her married to be on the safe side. The rationale being that the inclusion of an unmarried mother might cause offence and impact negatively on test takers' performance. This is questioned by the writer and subsequently by Mark, for whom the argument misses the point that such erasure is potentially disadvantageous to those test takers, in this case unmarried mothers, but also LGBT students who are, in his words, never represented. Now, the reasons for LGBT erasure are, I would suggest, several. On the one hand, there's the deeply embedded heteronormative fear that recognition of gender and sexual diversity will lead to greater gender and sexual diversity. Hence, the recurring moral panic in the right-wing press about the vulnerability of children and young people being exposed to supposedly dangerous ideas. The queer theorist Lee Edelman refers to this as the universal politics of reproductive futurism, in which the figure of the child, seen as being in need of protection, is deployed strategically with the aim of maintaining intact the compulsory heterosexuality underpinning patriarchal relations. On the other hand, as in the case of the ELT industry, there is a different and related fear, a fear that markets will only tolerate products that reflect a monosexual community of interlocutors. Although capitalism does not of necessity require adherence to heteronormativity, very far from it, in fact, it's also clear that in certain sectors there is a commitment to the profit that can be made from LGBT erasure. Even where such fears do not exist, there's often also the assumption that the top-down effect of legislative reform is sufficient in itself to bring about social change, a view that fails to recognize, in my opinion, the important role that teachers and teacher educators might play. Now, referring to such invisibilizing practices, the sociologist Andrew Sayre writes that the repeated refusal of recognition to an individual can produce serious psychological damage, and refusal of recognition to a group also damages its well-being and ability to function in wider society. This has been brought home to me very painfully on several occasions over the last few years in an ongoing research project. Since 2015, I've been regularly interviewing a Spanish-speaking trans man as he transitions from female to male. Until his recent self-identification as trans, Lucas, as I'm calling him, had lived for most of his adult life as a lesbian, although he was never entirely comfortable with this identity. Growing up in the 1960s in a working-class family in a Catalan village, Lucas recalls that his childhood claims to be a boy were met with dismissive laughter by his parents and family members, while his primary school teachers insisted on seating him with the girls, despite his desire to be with the boys who were seated separately. However, as puberty approached and his body began to change, Lucas felt that he had to stop talking about what he refers to throughout the early interviews as my inner boy. Lucas attributes his subsequent alcoholism and drug addiction to the lack of recognition he received as a child and to the way in which he had to silence this inner boy. Lucas told me about the moment when, many years later, by which time he was in his mid-50s, a film he saw about a young trans man triggered the realization that he too was trans. And he describes this graphically and very movingly as follows. He says, when I saw this film, which blew the lid off things, and this boy got out who was buried since he was 10 years old, more or less, and he got out there, and then I went mental. He would return to this in subsequent interviews, telling me that as an adolescent, he had buried the boy, only to discover as an adult that the boy is alive. El niño está vivo, he says. He now feels that this boy needs to be recognized and allowed, as he puts it, to express himself and to feel safe. And of course, this is an upheaval in terms of his whole sense of self that in 2015 was beginning to take place in his 55-year-old body. Although happier today than at any stage in his life hitherto, the denial of recognition Lucas experienced as a child and the violence he was forced to inflict on himself has clearly had lasting consequences. And needless to say, he left school with no qualifications. Returning for a moment to the UNESCO 2016 report, there are a number of recommendations, 3 of which refer directly to learning materials and teacher education. Now, the first of these, learning materials and inclusivity, a lot has been written about inclusivity, about its limitations, and about the possibilities for queer pedagogical alternatives. The title of my talk pits inclusive education against queer pedagogy, although I want to suggest that these 2 approaches might more usefully be seen as overlapping circles, as in a Venn diagram, rather than as incommensurate discourses, which of course they can be. Inclusive education is an activity in which previously erased or marginalized groups are recognized in the curriculum as socially legitimate and equal participants in learning and teaching. At the same time, it is suggested that those students who are not from marginalized groups are given the opportunity to learn about the complexity of the world in which they live. Now, while it is to be expected that socially conservative forces of various kinds might oppose this, it's worth noting that many scholars working in a queer theoretical paradigm have also been critical. Queer theory refers to the variety of philosophical perspectives that coalesce around the critique of essentialized views of gender, heterosexuality as an institution, and the mechanisms whereby it is privileged, naturalized, and reproduced. As queer theory emerged in the 1990s, queer also became somewhat paradoxically an identity label for those who were gender and sexuality non-conforming, but who wished to distance themselves from the emerging conservative politics espoused by some gay campaigners, particularly in the United States. It was also seized on by those who wished to lay claim to a more fluid sense of self. As time has gone on, queer theorizing has broadened its remit beyond initial concerns with heteronormativity. Writing in 2005, David Eng, Judith Halberstam, and Jose Munoz in a key paper argue that in this intense time of death and war and of US unilateralism and corporate domination, queer studies now, more than ever, needs to refocus its critical attentions on public debates about the meaning of democracy and freedom, citizenship and immigration, family and community, and the alien and the human in all their national and global manifestations. From this perspective, queer continues to adopt an antagonistic stance vis-à-vis regimes of the normal, but there is a shift towards a broader and more intersectional social critique in which heteronormativity is not abstracted from other simultaneously interlocking axes of discrimination. Over 20 years ago, Deborah Britzman, the queer educationalist, argued in favor of a curriculum that would facilitate the proliferation of identifications in which the heteronormative worldview is challenged and in such a way that students could imagine new ontological possibilities or new ways of being for themselves. In doing so, she made a scathing attack on what has been referred to as the representational equality envisaged by some liberal educationalists, whereby LGBT characters are tokenistically added to the curriculum mix. Such an approach, she argues, amounts to little more than a politics of assimilation, whereby those identifying as LGBT become part of a new normal in ways that fail to address the mechanisms through which normativities work. One of the few representations of LGBT characters in ELT materials comes from this time and neatly illustrates what Britzman was railing against. In Choice Readings, a US resource book for teachers of migrants, there's a lengthy reading about two gay men who adopt a child. Now, this image here that I'm showing you is taken from the internet, although it's very similar, in fact, to the one in the original textbook, which I have not been able to reproduce. But as can be seen, these men are of a particular type. They're white. Their family, we're told, is like other families. They're in an established, stable relationship. The adoption was planned and not the result of a whim. And, crucially, they are financially secure. Later on in the reading, we learn that they're planning on buying a bigger house because, in addition to Elliot, the little boy that they've adopted, they have 3 dogs and they're hoping to adopt more children. Tom and Dimitri, are the 2 guys in question, are quite literally textbook examples of what the sociologist Diane Richardson discusses critically under the heading of good gays, and embodiments of what Lisa Duggan refers to as homonormativity. Homonormativity can be understood as heteronormativity's neoliberal cousin, and is based, as Duggan argues, on a politics of assimilation in which individualism, domesticity, and consumption are foregrounded. Such profoundly conservative representations are anathema to queer, as the artwork on the right suggests. Indeed, Michael Warner, who's generally credited with having coined the term heteronormativity, has argued that such gay men reek of commodity, giving off, as he puts it, the smell of capitalism. However, images such as these have become much more mainstream over the last 20 years since Britzman was writing, particularly in the media, and have been consistently criticized by queer commentators for their lack of awareness of intersectionality as it is lived by LGBT people. Intersectionality, whose roots in the 1970s lie in North American radical black lesbian feminism, refers to the view that issues of gender and sexuality cannot be disambiguated from those of race and class, or indeed other axes of discrimination, such as age, disability, religion, language, and migration status. Thus, scholars such as Jasbir Poor reacted angrily in 2010 to the inauguration of the It Gets Better website. It Gets Better is it's a youth-oriented digital platform created by two gay men in the wake of a spate of bullying-related LGBT teenage suicides in the US. And the site initially featured videos of white middle-class gay men and celebrity allies talking about their own fulfilled lives and reassuring teenage viewers who might be experiencing homophobic or transphobic bullying that things would eventually get better. Poor argued that queer people of colour, trans, genderqueer, and gender non-conforming youth and lesbians were unlikely, as she put it, to be inspirationally hailed by such interventions, however well-intentioned they might be. Poor's point is that such interventions are not only a form of erasure, they may also be alienating for many. Recent years have seen other queer scholars, such as Rahul Rao, draw attention to what he calls Homo capitalism. This refers to the ways in which entities such as the World Bank and the IMF strategically co-opt and deploy normative LGBT-friendly discourse as a way of presenting themselves as progressive to audiences in the global north, while pursuing policies in the global south that serve neoliberal interests. Such practices are also referred to in the queer studies literature as pinkwashing, whereby superficially progressive ideas are used to mask less progressive activities. At the same time, right-wing politicians across Europe have recently been seen to deploy LGBT-friendly discourse as part of their attacks on immigrant communities who are held to be antagonistic to gender and sexual diversity, despite the fact that migrant communities also contain queer people. From a similar perspective, Poor has coined the term homo-nationalism to refer to the regulatory scripts of normative homosexuality circulating in the global north, against which queer asylum seekers from the global south have their asylum claims judged. These scripts can be and are used to reject claims, despite the fact that the sexuality and gender categories of those seeking asylum do not always map neatly onto those of the global north. The point that I'm making is that the emergence of a sexuality and gender politics based on the quest for equal rights within existing social structures presents those of us who are committed to progressive education with a set of challenges. On the one hand, we wish to recognize our LGBT students, while at the same time enabling all our students to question prevailing normativities, whether hetero or homo, and crucially, the uses to which these are put. However, going back to Britzman's point about a curriculum that allows for a proliferation of identifications, it's clear that some kind of LGBT representation is both necessary and overdue. As the Indonesian poet Norman Erickson Pasaribu explains, reflecting on what he calls queer erasure and his own experience of school, when you don't see yourself on the page, it's harder to imagine yourself as a person. Going back to bell hooks for a moment, we can say that for students to live more fully in the world, they first need to be able to imagine themselves as a person. And the classroom, from the perspective of progressive education, should be capable of providing a space for that. But of course, there are limitations to an on-the-page only approach to representation and inclusivity. In his autobiographical novel, The End of Eddie, Edouard Louis describes his experience of growing up queer in small-town France at the end of the 20th century, in a working-class community decimated by unemployment and riddled with racism and toxic masculinity. The classroom was the one place in which he encountered the recognition he craved. And he writes, "Between the hallway at school, my parents, and the people in the village, I was trapped. My only reprieve was in the classroom. I liked the teachers. They never talked about dirty faggots. They explained that differences should be accepted. They voiced the discourse of the French educational system that we were all equal. People were not to be judged by the color of their skin, their religion, or their sexual orientation. That way of putting it, sexual orientation, would always make the boys at the back of the classroom snicker. Here, we see the limits of an inclusivity that does not go beyond the ventriloquizing of official discourse. Although it grants recognition to the teenage Eddie, and that is not inconsequential, it does not reach the boys at the back of the classroom. To go beyond the official discourse or beyond the words on the page, it is necessary to come to grips with the social processes that produce particular representations and not others, and to engage with the ways in which the boys at the back of the classroom have become invested in particular discourses. What then are the implications of all of this for ELT classroom practice? Foundational work by Cynthia Nelson, who has done more than anyone in our field to put gender and sexual diversity on our agenda, suggests 3 approaches for teachers who wish to address the issue of LGBT erasure and engagement with heteronorms in the classroom. Okay, the first of these is the counselling approach, which is very much an inclusive education one, in which homophobia and transphobia are addressed through a focus on equalities discourse, which may also, of course, be accompanied then by positive LGBT representations. The second one, the controversies approach, is also very much rooted in inclusive education. Here, the focus is on discrimination against LGBT people, with the overall aim of developing an awareness of rights and social justice through classroom discussion. And then the discourse inquiry approach, and the third one, is probably the queer pedagogy approach, really. And this approach seeks to engage with the discourses of heteronormativity, the ways in which discursive acts and cultural practices produce, promote, and maintain gender and sexual norms. The overall aim of this approach is to improve students' ability to comprehend, critique, and respond to these. Nelson argues that the discourse inquiry approach has been found to be the most effective with language learners. As my colleague Mel Cook and I argue in a forthcoming chapter in Brokering Britain, Educating Citizens, on a practical level, discourse inquiry may be more doable than other approaches, given that it relies on framing questions and problem posing about everyday heteronormativity, as well as that found in all published materials, and the ways in which these norms can be explored and challenged in classroom discussions. Crucially, it does not presuppose materials that include LGBT representation, which might be problematic in some settings where gender and sexuality have to be approached with great caution. Pakua and his colleagues, whose work I referred to earlier, provide some excellent examples of textbook content being challenged by students and their teacher. But they also make the point that such interventions presuppose a teacher who is sensitized to the pervasiveness of heteronormativity and able to spot the potential and the need for student engagement when opportunities present themselves. And I think that raises the whole issue of the importance of teacher education. Now, some of the most innovative work in this area, in this paradigm rather, is being done by colleagues associated with English for Action in the UK, an organisation that inducts teachers into the principles and practice of participatory ESL. It's also, in my view, a form of queer pedagogy, understood not only as a pedagogy in which queer concerns can be tackled, but also as a queering of pedagogy itself. In participatory ESL, which is indebted to the work of Paulo Freire, the teacher and the students share speaking rights, and lessons revolve around problem posing with regard to issues of concern or relevance to the students. This is generally approached through what is called the generation of a code. usually a picture or some kind of graphic representation of an issue, which is then discussed, a process in which the students and the teacher attempt to clarify what is at stake, how it affects them, and what solutions, if any, there may be. In their account of one lesson, Dermot Briers, Becky Winstanley, and Mel Cook describe how a group of Bangladeshi women in a class taught by all three of them introduced the topic of women riding bicycles, and the way in which some community elders, both male and female, negatively assessed such women as having, quote unquote, gone modern. The code, which you can see here, was then introduced, and it consists of a simple line drawing of a woman riding a bicycle while being pointed at by community members. The students were then asked to describe the drawing, to define the problem, to personalize it, to discuss their understandings of the nature of the problem, and to talk about solutions. In their reflection on the wide-ranging discussion that followed this, the writers argue that the topic of gender created a sense of solidarity among all the women in the group, including the female teachers. Men in the group, including the male teacher, were challenged by the women and questioned about such things as their involvement in domestic chores. The lesson can be seen as simultaneously a queering of normal teacher-student power relations and a troubling of gender norms the women were expected to adhere to in their daily lives. At the same time, the men in the group were made to reflect on their own investment in upholding normative gender roles. Other innovative contemporary approaches, more explicitly focused on LGBT inclusion, are also to be found in the ESL sector. Here, the work of Francesca Stella, Jennifer McDougall, Mina Limpa, and Jenny Spears, which was presented at the conference yesterday here, is particularly noteworthy. Engaging with LGBT and migrant inequalities, activities for the ESL Classroom, is a learning resource that emerged from a research project on LGBT migration to Scotland and is based on interviews with migrants and ESL teachers. What is particularly interesting about this material is its recognition of intersectionality in the lives of those depicted, in which there is no avoidance of racism, homophobia, and transphobia. There's also a wealth of background information for teachers of the kind recommended by the 2016 UNESCO report, along with visual materials and ideas for classroom activities, all of which could be customized by teachers working in different settings. In the unit on the family, 11 different family profiles are included, 2 of which are shown here. A lesbian couple consisting of a Bulgarian and a Spanish woman who are married and have a daughter, and a single mother from Tanzania with 2 children who's separated from her ex-husband. This is also an example, I think, of material that's inclusive, but which also succeeds in queering the idea of the family. One final resource that I want to mention is an edited volume from Germany by Maria Eisenman and Christian Ludwig. This book looks at the potential of literature and media texts for exploring gender and sexual diversity. And the editors make the important point in their introduction that if issues raised by legislative reform are to take hold in people's minds, then a more structured, bottom-up approach is needed in schools. As with the ESL resource, the chapters in the book suggest suitable texts and provide activities for teachers to use in the classroom. Now, literature, it seems to me, allows the teacher to do several things. On the one hand, there is the potential to include LGBT characters and perspectives, and on the other, to make it possible for those students who are not LGBT to come to a greater understanding of those who are, and for all students to be enabled to explore the ways in which gender and sexual normativities work, as well as the ways in which these may intersect with other aspects of identity. The cognitive psychologist Keith Oatley, in a paper on emotional response and identification in fictional narrative, includes this quotation from George Eliot: "The greatest benefit we owe to the artist is the extension of our sympathies." Here, sympathy is understood as the generation of a kind of fellow feeling, which Oatley suggests may convert as we read into empathy and identification. Drawing on Flaubert's theory of identification in reading, as voiced by the character Léon in Madame Bovary, he quotes him as follows. This is Léon. "Without leaving your chair, you stroll through imagined landscapes as if they were real, and your thoughts interweave with the story, lingering over details or leaping ahead with the plot. Your imagination confuses itself with the characters, and it seems as if it were your own heart beating inside their clothes." Oatley's argument, which is convincingly made, is that imaginative engagement with fictional narrative has the potential to result in cognitive change in readers. Such a view underpins the chapters in this book, and it may represent one way of engaging with the boys at the back of the classroom, particularly if the texts are well chosen. Now, I began by saying that the view of teaching I'm espousing in this talk is one in which the aim is to enable students to live more fully in the world. And it's clear that this presupposes a teacher who sees herself as a reflective practitioner, as certainly as understood by Cowan, or as some kind of critical pedagogue. To claim such an identity in the world in which we live is not always easy. Many teachers are constrained by a pedagogy of teaching to the test, and schools are still overwhelmingly heteronormative organizations. But I think we owe it to our students to try and claim such identities for ourselves where possible. In my interview with Mark, when I asked him how he saw the way forward, he said, "I think we have to be braver." Pakua and his colleagues make a similar point, but they note that we will be able to achieve more when we work together. They conclude their study by recommending a collective effort on the part of the whole profession: teachers, teacher educators, materials writers, textbook reviewers, etc., to come together to help create learning environments that address gender and sexual diversity. We might also consider working through our trade unions and teachers' professional organizations, those that we're members of. Their recommendation is one that I would like to echo here this morning. But this, of course, is not going to be easy, and there will be resistance. We see this today in the pushback in some quarters to the teaching of the 2010 Equality Act, for example, in primary schools in the UK. But in attempting to do so, all of us and our students, regardless of gender identity and sexual orientation, stand to benefit. Okay, thank you.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to John for that, and just a reminder to all of you that we will have a